One would like to assume that all right-thinking people would judge slavery to be morally abhorrent. Freedom is a virtue, and to deprive another of theirs is a most depraved act. But what if there was an even more sinister type of enslavement that bound both mind and body? Imagine a creature that has the capacity to utilize free will, but through some wicked arts, you deactivated it to the point that they weren't even aware that they had the potential to be free in the first place. This is Big Mike in the Morning, broadcasting only on 312 FM and DAB Digital Radio, here in sunny South Florida. We're bringing you the latest and greatest stories of the strange and unexplained. Today we have a very special guest, retired psychologist Dr. Martha B. Harris, with a bombshell story relating to the UFO phenomena. Welcome to the show, Martha. Thank you very much for having me. UFOs are a staple on Big Mike, and we always love to hear our listeners' accounts of their experiences, but they all tend to be quite similar. You, on the other hand, are claiming something new and potentially shocking, right? I am indeed, Mike, and you can expect a full account of it in my upcoming book, Aliens from Earth, due out next month. That title sounds pretty enticing. I hope you're going to give our listeners a taste of what to expect at the release. I'd be more than happy to. All right, let's do it. First of all, give the audience a snapshot of your background for those who aren't familiar. My academic background was quite banal for the longest time. I was an experimental psychologist at Oxford University for just shy of 10 years. Didn't take you long to shake things up, though. Oh yes, I managed to attract quite a bit of criticism from my academic colleagues who made a fuss over my research methods. There's only so many times your name can appear in headlines alongside the words unethical experiments before faculty leadership decides your reliability. They fired you? They saw my reputation as an embarrassment. They got tired of the student protests and bad press. Eventually, they bowed to the woke mob and declined to renew my contract. Jealous. The lot of them. That's a rough deal right there. How did you cope? I almost didn't, truth be told. I found solace in the bottle. Not great form for a psychologist. Clearly, I was suffering from depression symptoms and should have known better. Nonetheless, I plummeted quickly to the lowest rung and was a smidgen away from ending up homeless. How did you manage to turn it around? I was saved from becoming a less famous version of Jordan Peterson via the intercession of dumb luck. I was stumbling out of some pub, drunk up to my eyeballs, and I passed by this bunch of young men with American accents. They were all dressed up and looking as dapper as can be. Being in my early 30s and inebriated, they noticed me sampling the eye candy. "Hey, babe," one of them called out to me, and I stumbled right over to them. You must have been quite the catch. A hot mess, as the kids might say. So when I got over to them, the handsomest among them said that I looked like I knew where to have a good time and maybe I could show them. And so I took them right to my favourite pub, blushing and giggling without much in the way of dignity and self-respect. And then what? Well, I don't remember many details from that night, but I do recall that my favourite lad introduced himself as Monty Butterworth. A famous name! Quite right, but at the time, I must say, I hadn't the foggiest idea who he was. I never paid much attention to the world beyond academia. I didn't know the Berlin Wall had fallen until the late 1990s. I think he was disappointed that I didn't gasp in awe and wonder. Quite grumpily, he asked for my name, and I tell him. Then he got the reaction out of me, because he knew who I was. A nice bit of irony there. I was about as far from mainstream famous as it was possible to be. so I assumed he must be an academic and read one of the hit pieces that was put out about me. But instead of joining the dog pile, he leans in and says he's an admirer of my work on free will. Some praise for once. Absolutely. And then he asked for my number, saying he'd love someone with my research background to come work for his company. Of course, I took it, but I thought it was just the drink talking. So we danced the rest of the night away with no expectation that anything would ever come of it. And did something happen in the end? About 4 p.m. the next day, I was a touch hungover and ramming the second greasy bacon butty down my throat when the telephone rang. I slouched over and picked it up. I heard this suave, confident American accent, saying that he was hoping my head wasn't hurting too badly today, and whether or not I'd considered his offer of employment. Had you? Absolutely not. But in the moment, I just dumbly said yes, sign me up. Couldn't get a more fateful gut reaction than that. No, indeed, as much to my surprise as anyone else's. Within 3 months, I was on a jet plane to the States, with a new job, a new life, and the start of it all. What was it like starting work for the infamous Butterworths? Was there any indication something was off with them? When I started, they made us sign a non-disclosure agreement. Everything was rather hush-hush, but nothing extraordinary. I assumed that maybe this was just how it was working in industry. I'd only ever worked for universities. Perhaps I was simply naive and thought maybe they were worried about their competitors stealing their intellectual property. Did you enjoy your time there? Immeasurably. It was a researcher's paradise. I had no idea where they got their money from, but all I had to do was come up with a project, lift the phone to old Monty, and the funding would be there the next day. Sounds ideal. It was. But I realized after a few years that my unprecedented academic freedom was somewhat of an illusion. What do you mean? Monty was a persuasive man. As well as being my ultimate boss, he became a friend. We spoke and spent time with each other outside of work. He was very interested in my research area, and we often chatted about it, usually over a glass of wine. It was only well into my late career that I looked back and realized the vast majority of my research proposals had their origins in my chats with Monty. Are you saying he was manipulating you? That's exactly what I think he was doing, and every time I would start a project, it would look rather darker in retrospect. Darker? Less ethical, more extreme. But it was so gradual that I did not really notice it. Any questions I had about where they got the subjects or the potential harm that may come, Monty just brushed them off, saying they had it all under control. He just told me to focus on the research and leave all the details to him. Did you? Yes, I'm ashamed to say. Some of the things we did made the experiments for which I was exiled from public academic life look like mere trifles. But I trusted Monty. He made me feel like everything was peace and harmony. Was one of those dark projects about aliens? In a manner of speaking. It was relating to the creatures, which are thought of in popular culture as aliens, specifically grey aliens. Are they not aliens? They're from Earth, but they certainly are alien to us. I'm not sure I follow. Maybe if you start when you first got into the alien project, then go from there. The first time I heard about Project Puppet Master, I was in my early 50s and had long since been promoted to the head of my department. Monty told me about it while we were holidaying on one of his yachts out in the Gulf of Mexico. He said it was something all the departments had been working on for a few years, and they found they had a need for a psychological researcher of the highest caliber. And that's you. He wouldn't reveal any details, though, and I was quite a pest about it. He just had me delegate my current research responsibilities to some subordinates and make an appearance at a lab I'd never visited before. Oh, that sounds nerve-wracking. Going into a mysterious Butterworth lab could be the start of a blockbuster horror movie. It was more like walking into a middle-class lounge. Monty walked with me to the location, and they scanned us through. Inside was a place with a nice sofa, carpet, and coffee table. I barely noticed that though, because when I walked in, I nearly keeled over backwards at what I saw. What did you see? An actual flesh and blood grey alien sitting on the couch. Just relaxing? Like he was waiting for coffee. By the way, Monty had a strong one made for me as they led me to sit opposite the grey. What did it look like? It was not quite as exaggerated as your typical image of the grey alien. Its head was not quite so large and its body was not quite so thin. It did have long, creeping fingers and toes that always give me the shivers. Monty told me they'd been calling it Bob. Bob? That's not the first name I'd think of for an alien. They said it's because it had a habit of making a gesture, or it would bob its head up and down. You call Bob it? Is Bob not a guy? They don't have biological sexes. Then how do they make babies? They don't. How would an alien race go on if they didn't make babies? As is the point of my book, they aren't aliens. They're not born, they're made. Then what are they? That question is hard to answer. But what was established with a great degree of confidence was what they were for. And that was? Slaves. The Greys were built to serve their creators as perfect, obedient labourers. How did you figure this out? Monty said they have suspected it was their purpose for a very long time, but lacked the means to confirm it. That's what they needed me for. They wanted me to get to know Bob and find out what I could from it. Did you make friends with Bob in the end? I like to think so. Once I'd recovered from the shock of seeing him, I'll refer to it as him for simplicity, and I was given the briefing of my job, I started to pay regular visits to Bob. The first hurdle I had was to learn his language. Bob couldn't speak English? Bob couldn't speak. In a very literal sense, they had no organs that could produce sounds that imitated human speech. Do they use sign language? They don't use language at all, as we understand it. They communicate with their minds. Telepathically. That's right. The first session I had with Bob, I just sort of sat there facing him. I was fascinated by his eyes. They were shaped like almonds and were totally black. It was a good thing he didn't understand human manners, because I did a lot of staring. Eventually, I landed at an impasse and was about to give up. I was feeling so uncertain and insatiably curious. It was overwhelming. That's when I realized what was happening. What? It was coming from outside of me in some manner. The feeling. It was actually Bob's feelings. He was uncertain and curious. About me. How did you know this? To this day, I have not got a clue. But I felt absolutely certain. He was communicating with me. So I sat back down on the sofa and tried to see if I could reply. It's funny when thinking back on it, but I shut my eyes tight, thought something really hard, and imagined my thoughts moving towards him. I felt that just made him more confused. So I let out a frustrated gasp of air, and inside I organically thought that I just wanted to know how to communicate with you. Wowee. That's when I felt a sudden change come about. He was sending me a copy of my own feeling of curious frustration. It was clear somehow that he was phrasing it as a question. What was he asking? He was asking what wanting was. This is quite a challenge to describe, but he isolated the emotion I felt and then brought it back to me with a hint of curiosity. I had started to understand a little of how this worked, and I just relaxed and let him see my thoughts. I thought to him that I didn't understand how he did not know what wanting was. And what did he say? He then sent an explanation that was a snapshot of how he felt, or rather, the lack of feeling. I can't put it into words, but Bob did not have the capacity to want or desire. It was alien to him. How does anyone, grey or not, live their life without wanting anything? That was the next question I posed to him. It took a while for me to appreciate what he meant. But what I pieced together was that his creators did the wanting. He was made to be a servant and to be given his commands. So when his master wanted something, that desire was transferred to him. He, in his own capacity, could not want. So he can only want what his bosses want? Precisely. What else did you learn from Bob? An enormous amount. I detail a lot of it in my book. But over the next 4-year period, I had countless conversations with Bob. For the first year or so, I could not commune with his mind for more than 15 minutes at a time. It resulted in a type of extreme exhaustion, so it took a while to get to know him. He was, however, always happy to see me, and he said I was the only master so far that he enjoyed being around. You're a master now? That's what he called every human, sort of. He didn't use words the way we do, but he thinks of us as those he should serve. But he said it was often much harder for him to understand what we wanted compared to his original masters. And who were they? I asked that many times. He did answer, but I could never quite process what he meant. The closest thing I can compare it to are angels. Like from the Bible? Sort of. He would send me visions of beings that somehow looked like they were made of flesh and bone and yet, at the same time, made of light. You've lost me there. I don't understand it either. But he said it was them who made him, and them who decided he was defective. Bob was broken? No, not quite. More like he did not meet the exacting design specifications. How do you mean? He explained it to me like this. When he was being created, his body was made first. Then they did something to bring down a shard of light from another place and put it in the body. Light? Another place? What? I wish I could answer that. That's just what he showed me. I started calling the other place Lightland for short. Monty became obsessed with my reports of it, and I'm pretty sure he had other teams working on figuring out what it was. Bob would go on to explain that once the shard of light was in the body, they would open it a certain amount. He sent me the image of the aperture of a lens opening. He showed me how wide it was for his kind, and how wide it was for a human baby. Finally, he showed me a width in the middle. That was him. That was why he was defective. So, his light thing was too wide for a grey, and too narrow for a human? I believe so. What these mental analogies he sends actually mean or represent, I can't begin to tell you. These unbelievable things were, to the angels and Bob's species, totally natural. We do not have to be told how to move our arms. They do not have to be told how to access some other reality, or some hidden version of our reality. This part is not exactly my area of expertise, but the number of physicists and other odd characters, who wouldn't disclose their specialities, they sent to interview me about it over and over again, made me think it must have been vitally important. Where did the Butterworths find Bob? They said they found him in a sort of coffin in Tibet. Buddhist monks there thought he was the mummified body of one of their forebears. When they confiscated him, they brought him back here and did their best to reactivate him. He was turned off? Apparently so. Bob said that when his creators discovered that he could experience some emotions like fear, curiosity, and happiness, they deemed him defective and deactivated him. The next thing he knew, he was waking up in our labs. He might be tens of thousands of years old or more, but he was only awake for a short while then and now, according to himself. Your time with Bob came to an end eventually, right? That it did. Monty, my old friend, passed away, and leadership of the department for the study of Bob, as I called it, was handed over to his nephew, James Butterworth. The James Butterworth? The one that recently had pictures of his private parts leaked on 4chan? That very one. At the time, he was barely out of university and He was about the most unqualified, arrogant little maggot I'd ever seen in my life. I did not appreciate the direction he wanted to take the project in. What was he proposing? He thought it would be a good idea to change the overall goal of our research, from finding out as much as we can about Bob, his creators, his body, and his mind, to finding out how we may best use him as a slave. This was a step too far for you? Bob was defective enough, or should I say, free enough, that in my view, it would have been unacceptable to do that. He was an honest, well-meaning creature, and I was not able to stomach the idea of abusing him like that. One morning I came into work and I told my new fresh-faced boss, Jimmy Butterworth, as much, and the obnoxious little brat simply laughed in my face. He sounds like quite the downer. I told him there and then that he wasn't a tenth the man his Uncle Monty was. That got him going. The man has a thin skin, and he was easy to rile. On that morning he must have been feeling particularly petty, with his lip out like a child. He tells me, "That's fine, Martha. He's bringing my role in the project to an end anyway." I asked what he meant. Was I being reassigned? He then grinned like an ugly badger and told me to follow him. Where did he take you? We went into one of the nearby cryo labs. When I walked in, my heart broke in two. Bob was lying there in the ice chamber, dead. Oh my God. I lost control, and I slapped Jimmy right across his irritating little face and demanded he tell me what he'd done. While trying not to let on that the hand of an aging woman had made him cry, he tells me what they decided, that Bob had become accustomed to interacting with humans. So, they terminated him, dissected his brain, and removed a crystalline organ they believe enables him to telepathically communicate. They said they wanted to try and create their own version, using it as a model. That sounds brutal. I don't know what's the right thing to say when your alien is killed, but if it's worth anything, I and my audience, I'm sure, are truly sorry for your loss. You're very kind to say so. At the time, I was so angry and grief-stricken that I stormed out and never came back. I sent them my official resignation the next day, and we came to an agreement that if I took early retirement and kept my mouth shut about my time working for them, then there need be no trouble. But you didn't keep your mouth shut. Your story's now on the airwaves and soon will be on the shelves of every major bookstore in the country. Although my retirement package was sizable, my conscience just wouldn't let me live in peace. How can you sit on a secret that size and just go back to normal life? I hope I never have to answer that question myself. I finally gave in when I ended up in the hospital after I took a dizzy spell and fell from my bicycle. When they were patching me up, I went through all the tests and follow-up appointments. They broke the news that they discovered a sizable brain tumour, which is what caused the dizziness. I went from thinking I just had vertigo to being told I only had a few years to live. I'm so sorry. Was there no chance of operating? It was too far gone, they said. It was a shock for a few weeks, but soon enough, I grew to accept it. But I found myself worrying less about my own mortality and more about memories of Bob and the Butterworths. It was then I decided that I needed to make my last few years count. I can't let secrets like that lie, especially not in the hands of people like Jimmy Butterworth. It's like leaving a nuclear bomb in the hands of a toddler. If the many conspiracy theories about the Butterworths are true, are you not scared they're going to retaliate? I'm already dying. I have no family or friends. My life was my work. What exactly are they going to threaten me with? They could try and silence you. That may be true, but I moved too quickly, and the word got out before they put a plug in it. They're arrogant, you see. Sometimes it turns out you have a little too much power for your own good, and you assume that nobody would dare try and defy you. It's that assumption that lets retirees like me shout your secrets from the rooftops before you even thought of looking. That's impressive. You played the biggest big bad the corporate world has ever seen. I do not wish to come across as bragging, but I admit that I am enjoying the thought of getting some small measure of revenge for my strange little grey friend. No doubt. When I read your book, I couldn't believe it. The Butterworth organization, exposed at last. What do you mean, read my book? It hasn't been released yet, save for a press summary. That's very true, but sometimes you find yourself in a privileged position. What's that you've got there? Is that my manuscript? How on earth do you have that? I sent it to the publisher. The last time I checked, this was a radio studio, not a publishing house. I was struck, Martha, by how you accused the Butterworths of arrogance, letting you get one step ahead of them. I think maybe you spoke too soon. What are you talking about? Who are these men? What are you doing? Get your hands off me at once! You hit the nail on the head when you said that you were detached from the world outside your own bubble. Maybe you should listen to the radio more often, just to make sure that the station that called you up is actually real. Oh, and say hey to Big Jimmy for me. You're with... Darn it, did you have to hit her that hard, fellas?